All right, so today we're going to be taking a deep dive into something pretty fascinating,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
We all know Donald Trump from his real estate days, but it seems like he's maybe looking at a slightly bigger picture now.
Yeah, it definitely grabbed my attention when I saw this.
Yeah, so he's been talking about expanding U.S. territory, and we're not talking like, small potatoes here.
Right.
We're talking about Canada as the 51st state,
No.
reclaiming the Panama Canal, and even setting sights on Greenland.
It does make you wonder, like, is it just for headlines or is there something more to it?
Right. Is this just, it's kind of a publicity stunt, or is
Yeah.
there some strategic logic behind these pronouncements?
Yeah, I think a lot of people probably saw it as just political theater, but when you really look at it, it kind of gives us a glimpse into how global power dynamics are really shifting.
Okay, so you're saying there might actually be a method to the madness.
Yeah, definitely something to unpack there.
So let's ditch the surface and dive deep.
Let's do it.
So what exactly are we talking about here? What has Trump actually said about each of these targets?
Well, let's start with Canada.
Okay.
Trump has kind of tossed around this idea of Canada just becoming the 51st state,
Wow.
even jokingly referring to Trudeau as, Governor Trudeau.
Oh, my gosh.
And his logic is that, by just eliminating the U.S.-Canada border, it would just benefit both countries economically and for, national security.
Wait, hold on. Eliminating the border. I mean, that's a pretty big move.
Yeah.
And what about the Canadians? I'm sure they would have some thoughts on suddenly becoming Americans.
Yeah, I mean, the reaction has been mixed, but it's definitely been an interesting one to follow.
I bet.
And then you've got the Panama Canal.
Right.
Now, this one's interesting because Trump has been pretty vocal about criticizing those Torrijos-Carter treaties, the ones that handed control of the canal back over to Panama in 77.
Wow.
He's called them follies.
Okay.
And even suggested that, the U.S. might need to just reclaim it for economic security.
It's like he's looking at international relations like it's just another real estate deal.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, where's the next big acquisition?
Yeah, and that's not too far off, actually,
Right.
because a lot of his approach to these things really reflects a very, kind of a transactional, a mercantilist mentality.
Okay, mercantilist. You have to break that down for me. That's not ringing any bells from high school history class.
Okay, so think of it this way. Mercantilism is like playing a game where the winner is whoever has the most gold.
Okay.
It's this idea that a nation's power is directly tied to its wealth, so governments should prioritize maximizing exports and limiting imports.
So it's all about, winning the economic game, coming out on top.
Yep. And then that brings us to Greenland.
Okay.
Trump has been very, very open about wanting to acquire Greenland, even calling it absolutely necessary for the U.S.
Wow.
And once again, he cites national security. And he's even hinted at using tariffs against Denmark if they resist.
Hold on. Tariffs on Denmark? They're a U.S. ally? I mean, that doesn't seem very friendly.
It definitely raised some eyebrows, but it also really highlights how important Greenland is strategically, especially with the rise of this new, bipolar world order.
Okay, another term I'm going to need you to unpack for me.
Mm-hmm.
Bipolar world order. What exactly are we talking about?
So for decades after the Cold War, the U.S. was the top dog globally.
Right.
But things have changed.
Yeah.
China is rapidly rising. Russia is kind of reasserting its power. And so now we're seeing this shift towards a world with two main centers of power,
Sure.
the U.S. and China, and they're vying for influence.
So it's like everyone's just scrambling for territory and resources on the global stage.
Got it.
So why is the Arctic suddenly so important?
Yeah.
I mean, for a long time, it was considered just this vast, icy wasteland.
Right. But climate change is rapidly melting that ice.
Right.
And that means access to a treasure trove of resources.
Right.
Oil, gas, and rare earth metals.
Wow.
We're talking potentially $1 trillion worth of resources.
$1 trillion. That changes things. So we're not just talking about some far-off icy land anymore.
No, not at all. And Greenland, with all its resources and its location,
Right.
it's right at the center of this whole scramble for the Arctic.
So it's not just about, grabbing the resources themselves. It's also about who controls access to them.
Exactly.
Who gets to call the shots in this new Arctic frontier?
Exactly. Control of the Arctic means control over those key shipping routes and a serious edge when it comes to economic and military power.
This is getting pretty interesting. So we're talking about, a whole new frontier opening up here with the potential to completely reshape the global balance of power.
Exactly. And that's why Trump's focus on Greenland is so interesting.
But doesn't the U.S. already have a military base in Greenland? I mean, they've had a presence there for a while, haven't they?
They do, but Trump has taken it a step further by actually questioning Denmark's control over Greenland.
So is he seriously suggesting that the U.S. could just, take it? Even for him, that seems like a pretty bold move.
Well, he hasn't explicitly said that, but his rhetoric definitely suggests he's willing to shake things up, to assert American dominance, even if it ruffles a few feathers.
So let's bring this back down to earth for a second. Why should the average person even care about who controls some ice and rocks in the Arctic?
Right.
I mean, what's the real-world impact here?
Well, remember, it's not just ice and rocks anymore.
Right.
We're talking about resources that could fuel future technologies, power our economies, and really shape the global landscape for decades to come.
Okay, so I'm starting to see the bigger picture here.
Yeah.
It's like this giant treasure chest is slowly opening up.
Yeah,
And everyone wants a piece of the action.
exactly. And Trump's moves, while controversial, are a pretty clear signal that the U.S. wants to be a major player in this new Arctic game.
But isn't the U.S. already a part of the Arctic Council, that
Yeah.
international group that handles Arctic issues?
They are, thanks to Alaska.
Right.
But they're facing some stiff competition from Russia, the traditional Arctic power,
Right.
and China, which is quickly expanding its influence in the region.
Wow, this is starting to sound like a real-life geopolitical thriller. Melting ice, hidden treasures, rising superpowers, and a U.S. president who seems determined to redraw the map.
Yeah, and we haven't even talked about the Panama Canal yet.
Oh, right. That's another piece of this global puzzle. I'm definitely curious to dig deeper into why Trump is so fixated on it.
Well, the Panama Canal is one of the most important shipping routes in the entire world,
Right.
connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans.
Right.
It's a vital artery for global trade and holds immense economic and strategic significance.
So is Trump worried about losing access to the canal?
Well, it's not quite that simple. Technically, the canal is neutral, open to all ships.
Okay.
But Trump has expressed concerns about its potential vulnerability and the growing influence of China in the region.
Ah, so it's that bipolar world order thing again.
Yeah.
China's rise is making the U.S. nervous about maintaining control over these key strategic points.
Yep.
This is all so fascinating. I can't wait to delve deeper into the Panama Canal and its role in all of this. And what about Canada? Can't forget about our neighbors to the north.
You're right. Trump's comments about Canada might seem like just another way to get attention.
Right.
But they actually reveal a lot about how he sees the world and his approach to international relations.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but I'm eager to dive deeper into each of these territorial ambitions.
Yes, me too.
So let's start by heading back up to the Arctic.
Sounds good.
That seems like a good place to start.
Yeah, the Arctic is fascinating and complex.
Yeah?
And understanding the geopolitics up there is key to understanding what's happening on a larger scale.
All right, let's go.
All right. So we're back in the Arctic, this region that's like transforming right before our eyes from this frozen wasteland into this geopolitical hotbed. And at the center of it all
Right.
is Greenland, with all of its untapped potential and its strategic importance. You mentioned earlier that there's like $1 trillion worth of resources just waiting to be tapped in the Arctic. Can you break that down for me? What exactly are we talking about?
Yeah. Well, for starters, there's vast reserves of oil and natural gas.
Okay.
And as the global demand for energy keeps rising, these Arctic reserves are looking more and more appealing.
Right. But extracting oil and gas in the Arctic, it's notoriously difficult and expensive, right? I mean, it's not exactly the easiest place to work.
It definitely has been challenging
Yeah.
in the past,
Yeah.
but with the melting ice,
Yeah.
coupled with all the advances in technology, Arctic extraction is actually becoming more feasible.
So it's not just about the resources themselves, it's also about the technology that's making them accessible.
Yeah.
Like a new gold rush, but with, high-tech drilling rigs and icebreakers instead of picks and shovels.
That's a great analogy. And then there's the matter of rare earth metals,
Oh, right.
which are these essential components for pretty much every modern technology.
Right. From our smartphones to electric vehicles.
Yeah, so we're not just talking about powering our homes and cars.
Yeah.
We're talking about, like, the building blocks of the entire digital economy.
Exactly. And here's the thing. China currently controls a vast majority of the global production of these rare earth metals.
Oh, wow. So that's where this national security argument comes in.
Yeah.
The U.S. doesn't want to be reliant on China for something so crucial.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. Control of Greenland could give the U.S. a real strategic advantage
Right.
in this game of resource control.
Okay, so I'm really starting to see why Greenland is such a desirable location.
Yeah.
But let's talk about the elephant in the room, the environmental impact. The Arctic is already facing huge challenges from climate change. isn't increasing resource extraction going to make things even worse?
Yeah, you're right to raise that concern. The environmental stakes are very high. Increased shipping traffic, oil and gas drilling, mining activities. They all pose significant risks to the fragile Arctic ecosystem.
It's a bit of a catch-22, isn't it?
Yeah.
Melting ice opens up access to these resources. But exploiting those resources could accelerate climate change and cause even more damage.
It's definitely a delicate balance.
Yeah.
And that's why international cooperation is going to be crucial.
Right.
We need to find ways to balance economic development with environmental protection.
Right.
To make sure that anything that happens in the Arctic is sustainable and responsible.
Okay, that sounds like a pretty tall order.
Yeah.
Are there any international agreements or organizations in place that can help manage this complex situation?
There are. The Arctic Council, which we talked about a bit earlier,
Right.
is really the main forum for addressing these Arctic issues.
Okay.
It's made up of the 8 Arctic states, including the US, Canada, Russia, and Denmark, which represents Greenland.
So even though Greenland is technically a Danish territory, they have their own voice in these discussions.
To a certain extent, yes, Greenland actually has a high degree of autonomy,
Okay.
and their government has become much more assertive in recent years
Okay.
about their own interests in the Arctic.
Interesting. So even within what seems like a straightforward territorial dispute, there are layers of complexity
Oh, absolutely.
and competing interests at play.
Yeah, and it's really important to remember that Greenland isn't just some piece of real estate. It's home to over 56,000 people,
Right.
primarily Inuit who have their own culture and traditions.
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
We can't just talk about the Arctic in terms of geopolitics and resource competition.
Right.
We have to consider the human element, too.
Exactly. The people of Greenland have a right to self-determination and to benefit from any economic development that happens on their land.
Right. Okay, so we've spent a good amount of time in the Arctic.
Yeah.
Let's switch gears and talk about the Panama Canal.
Okay.
You mentioned that Trump has expressed concerns about its vulnerability.
Right.
What is he worried about exactly?
Well, the Panama Canal is essentially a narrow, man-made waterway.
Right.
It's only about 50 miles long, and at its narrowest point, it's only about 110 feet wide.
Wow, that's incredibly narrow, especially when you consider the size of the ships that pass through it. Right? I could definitely see how that could make it vulnerable to all sorts of disruptions.
Exactly. Any kind of blockage, whether it's a natural disaster, an accident, or even an act of sabotage, could have massive repercussions for global trade.
I see. So it's not just about controlling the canal itself, it's also about ensuring its security and stability. It's a vital artery for the global economy.
Right.
And any kind of disruption could have this cascading effect.
Exactly. And that's where Trump's concerns about Chinese influence come into play.
Right. You mentioned earlier that China is heavily investing in Latin America, and the Panama Canal is right in their backyard.
Yeah, that's right. China has been very strategic about building ports, investing in infrastructure, and strengthening their diplomatic ties throughout Latin America.
So is Trump worried that China could somehow take control of the canal?
It's not clear if China has any intention of taking over the canal outright,
Yeah.
but they could certainly exert a lot of influence through their economic leverage and political pressure.
And that's something that the U.S. definitely wants to avoid.
Exactly. The Panama Canal is a critical choke point
Right.
for global trade, and the U.S. wants to maintain its strategic advantage in
Yeah.
the region.
This is really starting to feel like a high-stakes game of chess,
Yeah.
with the U.S. and China making strategic moves to gain control of
Yeah.
these key pieces on the board.
It is a lot like that, and the Panama Canal is definitely a key piece in this whole global power game.
Okay, so we've talked about the Arctic and the Panama Canal. What about Canada? What's the story there?
Well, Trump's comments about Canada might seem like the most far-fetched of all of his ambitions,
Right.
but they actually reveal a lot about his America First worldview.
America first. You mean his policy of putting American interests above all else?
Exactly. And for Trump, that means securing American dominance in North America,
Okay.
both economically and strategically.
So does he just see Canada as like a natural extension of the U.S., like a territory that should be under American control?
It's tough to say for sure what his true intentions are, but his rhetoric certainly seems to suggest that he views Canada as more of a subordinate partner
Right.
than an equal ally.
Yeah, that's got to be pretty insulting to Canadians. I mean,
Yeah.
Canada's a proud and independent nation with its own distinct identity and culture.
It definitely hasn't been well received up in Canada.
Right.
There's been a lot of pushback against Trump's
I
comments.
can imagine.
A lot of Canadians have expressed anger and resentment
Right.
at being treated as a potential U.S. takeover target.
Yeah. I mean, despite their close ties with the U.S., Canadians are very protective of their sovereignty.
Yeah, definitely. So do you think Trump's comments about Canada are just bluster, or is there a real possibility that he might actually try to pressure them into some kind of closer union with the U.S.?
Yeah. Is there a chance this is more than just talk?
Yeah. Well, it's hard to say for certain. Trump is known for being unpredictable,
Right.
and he's made a lot of bold statements that he's later backed away from.
Yeah. So we'll just have to wait and see.
I think for now, yes.
Mhm.
But it's definitely something to keep an eye on,
Right.
especially considering these bigger geopolitical shifts we've been talking about.
Right. This is all incredibly fascinating, but honestly a little unsettling too. It feels like the world is becoming a much more competitive and unpredictable place.
It definitely is. The old rules of the game are changing,
Right.
and we're seeing this resurgence of great power competition
Yeah.
that we haven't really seen since the Cold War.
So what does this mean for the future? What can we expect to see as these ambitions play out on the global stage?
Well, I think we're going to see increased competition and tension, not just between the U.S. and China,
Right.
but also between other major powers and regional players.
So a more fragmented and conflict-prone world. That's a pretty sobering thought.
Yeah, it's a possibility, but it doesn't have to be the only outcome.
Okay.
There's also an opportunity for greater cooperation and collaboration
Right.
to address some of these common challenges like climate change and global inequality.
So it's not all doom and gloom.
No, not at all.
There's still hope for a more peaceful and sustainable future.
Absolutely. But it's going to require a shift in mindset away from this idea that there always has to be a winner and a loser,
Yeah.
and towards a more cooperative approach based on shared interests and mutual respect.
That sounds like a tall order.
Yeah, it is. It's a goal worth striving for, though.
Definitely. Well, this has been a really enlightening conversation.
Mm.
I feel like I have a much better grasp of the forces at play that are shaping the world.
I'm glad to hear that. And remember, these are just a few of the many interesting and important topics that we discuss here on the Deep Dive.
That's right. We're always diving deep into the most pressing global challenges,
Yeah.
uncovering those hidden connections and trying to give you the insights you need
Right.
to understand our complex world.
And if you enjoyed this deep dive, we encourage you to like, subscribe, and share it with your friends.
We're all in this together, and the more informed we are, the better equipped we'll be to
Exactly.
face the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead.
Stay curious, keep exploring, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.
Okay, so we've explored, these different targets, the Arctic, the Panama Canal, and Canada. And it's clear that Trump's approach to, territorial expansion, it's not exactly conventional,
Right.
but I'm still trying to grasp the bigger picture here. What's the overall strategy driving these seemingly disparate ambitions?
It's like he's playing a high-stakes game of global risk, right?
Yeah.
But instead of just accumulating territory, he's after these very specific locations
Right.
that have real strategic value, resources, trade routes, choke points,
Right.
things that can give the U.S. an edge in this new bipolar world order.
Okay, so it's not just about, expanding the map. It's about strategic positioning.
Yeah,
In a world where those power dynamics are really shifting.
exactly. Trump's moves, as provocative as they often are ultimately about maintaining that U.S. dominance.
Right.
In a world where power is no longer concentrated solely in the West.
Right.
The rise of China and the resurgence of Russia, they're changing the game.
Yeah.
And Trump is determined to make sure that the U.S. stays ahead of the curve.
So how do these specific ambitions, Canada, Greenland, the Panama Canal, how do they fit into that broader strategy? It still feels a bit like a puzzle
Right.
with missing pieces.
Well, let's start with the Arctic. We talked about how climate change is transforming the region,
Right.
opening up access to all these vast resources and
Right.
new shipping routes.
Right.
By securing a foothold in Greenland, the U.S. could gain a serious advantage
Right.
in this new Arctic frontier. They could counter the influence of Russia and China.
Right.
It's about securing those resources for the future and projecting power
Okay.
in a very strategically important region.
And what about the Panama Canal? How does that fit onto this strategic chessboard?
Well, the Panama Canal is really a linchpin of global trade, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans.
Right.
Controlling that waterway would give the U.S. immense leverage
Yeah.
over global commerce and military movement. So, by challenging the existing treaties and raising the possibility of reclaiming the canal,
Right.
Trump is signaling that the U.S. won't tolerate any perceived threats
Okay.
to its dominance in that region.
Right.
It's a power play,
Right.
plain and simple.
And Canada, that still seems like the odd one out in all of this.
Yeah.
What's the strategic logic behind incorporating Canada into the U.S.?
Well, from Trump's perspective, Canada is a vital piece
Right.
of that North American puzzle.
Okay.
By pushing for those closer ties or even annexation,
Yeah.
he's aiming to solidify U.S. control over the entire continent
Okay.
and prevent any potential rivals from getting a foothold.
Right.
It's about reinforcing American power in its own backyard.
So it all comes down to maintaining that American dominance,
Yeah,
ensuring that the U.S. stays on top
right.
on the global stage and within its own hemisphere.
Yeah,
It's a very assertive, some might even say aggressive approach
right.
to foreign policy.
It definitely is. And it's a big change from the more multilateral cooperative approach.
Right.
That kind of defined U.S. foreign policy for much of the post-Cold War era.
Right.
Trump's strategy is all about asserting that American power,
Okay.
even if it means going it alone or upsetting people along the way.
It's a high-risk, high-reward kind of game.
Yeah.
But is it sustainable in the long run? Can any one country really dominate
Right.
in today's world?
That's the big question. The world is becoming increasingly multipolar,
Right.
with power being distributed among more and more players.
Yeah.
Trump's approach, this go-it-alone approach, might get some wins in the short term,
Okay.
but it also risks alienating allies and creating instability in the long run.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners? What should they be paying attention to as these ambitions kind of unfold on the world stage?
I think it's important to watch how these power dynamics change.
Right.
Will Trump's approach ultimately succeed in maintaining that American dominance?
Right.
Or will it backfire and lead to a more fragmented and conflict-prone world?
These are some big questions with no easy answers.
Yeah.
But one thing is certain. It's a really interesting time to be following geopolitics.
It is.
And understanding these ambitions
Yeah.
is key to making sense of how the global landscape is shifting.
Absolutely. And that's what we try to do here on the Deep Dive.
Right.
We explore these complex issues that are shaping our world
Right.
and hopefully give you the insights you need
Yeah.
to navigate all of this.
If you enjoyed this deep dive into Trump's territorial ambitions, be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. We're all in this together, and the more informed we are, the better equipped we'll be to face the challenges and opportunities that are out there. Until next time, keep exploring.